The sun was just beginning to rise over a peaceful suburban street, the kind of place where trouble seemed like a distant concept. Everything appeared serene. Birds sang their morning melodies, children laughed as they played, and neighbors exchanged cheerful greetings while starting their daily routines. Behind the closed doors of one such home lived a small family, a father named William, his 10-year-old son Chris, and soon a new addition would arrive in their lives. William had raised Chris on his own since his wife's tragic passing when Chris was only 5. The bond between father and son was unbreakable, rooted in love, care, and an understanding forged through shared grief. But life was about to take a dark turn, one no one could have predicted. William had recently remarried. Clara entered their lives like a breath of fresh air, someone who promised to fill the void left behind by Chris's mother. She was charming, beautiful, and seemed to adore William and Chris equally. The wedding was small but beautiful, filled with laughter and promises of a bright future. William believed that after years of being a single father, he had finally found someone to help him care for Chris. Clara's sweet words and seemingly loving gestures made her appear to be the perfect stepmother. In the early days, Clara played her role well. She showered Chris with affection, cooked him meals, helped him with his schoolwork, and even bought him little gifts. Chris, at first hesitant, began to warm up to her. After all, William loved her, and the idea of having someone who could act as a mother was comforting to the boy. For a while, it seemed their small family would thrive. William was happier than he had been in years, and Chris, despite missing his mother, started to believe that maybe this was how his life was supposed to be now. But, as with all masks, Clara's facade began to slip. Over time, her warm demeanor started to cool, especially when William was not around. It began with small, almost unnoticeable things: Chris's favorite toy disappearing, lunches being forgotten, and cold remarks replacing words of encouragement. Chris, still a child, didn't fully understand why the woman who had promised to love and care for him was now acting so differently. He tried to brush it off, telling himself she might just be having bad days. However, Clara's small cruelties began to pile up. She mocked Chris for being clumsy, blamed him for things he hadn't done, and her once affectionate gestures turned cold and dismissive. On days when William was at work, Clara's cruelty escalated. When Chris asked for help with his homework, she ignored him. When he asked for a snack, she pretended not to hear. She began locking him in his room for hours, telling him he was worthless, that his father loved her more than he could ever love a child. Chris, confused and hurt, never dared to tell his father. He was too young to understand why his stepmother had turned so hateful, and he didn't want to make his father upset. Often, he sat alone in his room, staring out the window, wondering what he had done to make Clara hate him. His once vibrant and playful demeanor began to fade. The boy who used to laugh freely and play with boundless energy became withdrawn, quiet, and anxious. His friends at school noticed the change, and so did his teachers, but no one knew the extent of what was happening behind closed doors. Clara's resentment towards Chris had deep roots. Though William and Chris had no way of knowing, her own childhood had been filled with pain and rejection. She had grown up in a broken home, neglected by her parents and despised by her stepmother. The bitterness she harbored from her past had never healed. Now, in the presence of an innocent child who reminded her of her own abandonment, that bitterness turned to jealousy and hatred. She began to see Chris as an obstacle to the life she wanted with William, a reminder of a past she desperately wanted to forget. One cold winter evening, the tension in the house reached its breaking point. William had left for a business trip, leaving Clara alone with Chris. That night, Chris accidentally spilled his dinner while setting the table. It was a simple mistake, but to Clara, it was the last straw. Her fury exploded in a blind rage. She began screaming at Chris, calling him names and accusing him of ruining her life. Chris, terrified and confused, tried to apologize, but his words only fueled her anger. In a fit of uncontrollable rage, Clara grabbed Chris and pushed him. He stumbled, lost his balance, and fell down the stairs. For a moment, the house was deathly silent. Clara stood at the top of the stairs, her heart pounding in her chest as she stared at Chris's small, motionless body lying at the bottom. Panic set in. She rushed down the stairs, shaking him, trying to wake him up. His breathing was shallow, and his face was pale. The realization of what she had done hit her like a tidal wave, but instead of calling for help out of genuine concern, Clara's mind raced to cover up her crime. She dialed 911, but when the operator answered, Clara's voice was filled with feigned concern. He tripped down the stairs. It was an accident, she sobbed, though inside she was calculating every word. Chris was rushed to the hospital in critical condition. William arrived shortly after, his face pale with worry, as doctors worked frantically to save his son. Clara played her role well, pretending to be the devastated mother figure. She clung to William, crying about how much she cared for Chris. But deep inside, Clara was terrified, not for Chris's life, but for the truth to be revealed. Days passed, and Chris remained in a coma. William was consumed by grief, praying for his son to wake up. Clara continued to act the part of the concerned stepmother, but cracks in her story began to show. One of the neighbors, a kind elderly woman who had always taken a liking to Chris, came forward with unsettling information. She had often heard Chris's cries and Clara's angry voice through the walls. The neighbor had noticed bruises on Chris before, but had dismissed them as typical childhood accidents. Now, with Chris in the hospital, she couldn't stay silent any longer. The police were called, and an investigation was launched. Clara's past began to unravel, and it wasn't long before the authorities uncovered the truth. The bruises, the emotional, the cold neglect, it all pointed to a pattern of cruelty that had been escalating for months. Clara was arrested and charged with child act and attempted murder. Her facade had crumbled, revealing the monster beneath. Despite the best efforts of the doctors, Chris never regained consciousness. After weeks of fighting for his life, his small body gave in to the injuries. The funeral was heartbreaking. William, shattered by grief, could barely stand as he said goodbye to his son. The boy who had brought so much light into his life was gone, taken by the very woman he had trusted to care for him. In the courtroom, Clara sat quietly as the judge sentenced her to a long prison term. Her once beautiful face was now hollow and cold, her eyes empty as she faced the consequences of her actions. But no prison sentence could bring back the life she had taken. William, forever haunted by the loss of his son, was left to pick up the pieces of his shattered life. Chris's story is more than a tale of tragedy. It's a powerful reminder that evil often wears the most deceptive masks. It teaches us the importance of vigilance, of truly hearing the voices of children who may lack the words to articulate their pain. It reveals how unhealed wounds from the past can manifest into acts of unimaginable cruelty. Above all, it underscores the necessity of love and kindness, showing how their absence can shatter lives. Chris's light must serve as a beacon, urging us to protect the innocent, confront evil, and never ignore the silent cries of a suffering child. The darkness lurking behind closed doors must be exposed, for only in the light can justice truly prevail.